So right now we're going to be doing a comparison between the LG C1 and the Samsung Q8FN. The top image represents the Q8FN, the bottom image is going to represent the LG C1. Essentially, if you want the short answer, it's basically a battle between peak brightness, luminosity, and contrast on that end of things versus detail, really fine detail and ultra clarity leading to great depth. That's essentially what you're looking at here. Also, the C1 does tend to have a little bit more in the way of color accuracy versus Samsung, but in some scenes, as you will see, they do flip. So we're going to do a photo analysis because of just how different both displays are. The Samsung being able to get well over 1900 nits and the LG not really being able to do that, being substantially dimmer. Obviously, there's a difference in peak brightness, so to try to get that on camera was literally impossible, so we're doing a photo analysis of each screen bracketed and corrected as far as the exposure and all that stuff in camera so that you guys are seeing as close to a real-world representation as to what you're going to see. All that housekeeping out of the way, let's get into the stuff. Okay, so when you look at the image at the top here, you see Harley Quinn very clearly on the Q8FN, the luminosity coming off of the computer, the lights on the floor in the background, all the little practical lights make a lot more sense. Counteractively, though, when you look at the C1, even though it's not as bright as the Q8FN and you're definitely not getting as much color volume, you are getting deeper color because it's not as bright, so it has the ability to spread out what it has a lot more evenly at richer shades. And you do have staggering clarity where you're just able to see more if you really pay attention on Harley Quinn's face, albeit there is a substantial loss in brightness by comparison. Going to the next image, you can see Spider-Man on his building, and you can see that there's a lot more detail, obviously, on the OLED when you look at the darker areas of the image. But when you start looking at the brighter areas of the image, you can notice that there are some things that aren't really as punchy as they should be. The highlight in the sky is one of them. On camera, it picked up phenomenally well, but in reality, the Samsung was just so bright, I couldn't capture any of that dynamic range because it's just way too dynamic. And I really honestly didn't feel like sitting there for like 12 hours editing in the HDR that I saw in real life. So I'm honestly just going to tell you, trust me, it was there and it looked really, really good. Now, if we look at this image, you can notice that Triple H at the bottom on the C1 is just destroying everything that the Samsung is doing at the top. You have way better skin tonality, you have way better control over colors, and it looks generally better. There was only one area of weakness that I saw by comparison, and that is the color red. The Samsung Q8FN at the top was able to get it way better than the LG C1 at the bottom. So that's just something to think about. But overall, I think that the C1 definitely took this particular scene or imagery. Then going on to this image, we have both that honestly, if I'm being real with you, felt more like a tie than anything else. Now, the C1 obviously loses in the brightness category, but when you pay close attention to the little details in the image, Samsung has a lot of that stuff there and most of that stuff there. And honestly, it was hard to tell a difference between these two TVs with my own eyes as I, again, was going back and forth and really getting an idea of what these were capable of. And the thing that really struck me was just how close the Samsung keeps up. Now, again, because of the limited dynamic range of my camera, I'm not able to capture all the little fine contrasty bits and details, especially once we get to the higher levels of peak brightness. But believe me when I tell you, it was pretty amazing on both displays, though I did prefer the luminosity on the Samsung, and ultimately that's where I kind of lean for this one. So then we look at images like this. This is where it kind of gets a little challenging for LG because lower light scenes like this don't really do it a whole lot of favors. Yes, you do have good luminosity spread, but the C1 this year isn't as bright as something like the G1 or A90J, so you're definitely not going to be experiencing the blasting peak highlights that you're expecting out of it, especially considering a lot of people are under the assumption that this is an Evo panel, and yeah, that's going to really disappoint a lot of people because there's nothing Evo about this. And when you look at the Samsung Q8FN, I mean, it's got all the highlights in all the right spots of the image, and the color volume is just better on this image. So the win for this particular scene comparison goes to the Q8FN. Now looking at this, it was a domination for the C1. This is where you can see the AI processing chip really doing a great job at drawing and rendering objects in geometry correctly. So you can see things like the buildings three-dimensionally casting shadows the way they're supposed to, where on the, again, Q8FN, it's an LED, right? So you're only going to be able to do so much with that technology, and this is where we're seeing those limitations come in. Tight corridor spaces like this where you have shadows casting on the ground, a lot of ambient light coming in. These scenes are going to be far more expressive on an OLED, and the C1 with their refinements with the Gen 4 Alpha 9 chipset is going to be incredible. So definitely say, even though it's not as bright as the Q8FN, the C1 takes the cake for this one as far as overall impact. Though the colors, particularly the primary colors, were more vibrant on the Q8FN, and if you're after vibrancy, that's going to be the one that takes the cake for you. Now, moving on to this image, we can see that there's just so much happening here as far as luminosity on the Q8FN that it'd be hard not to notice, but counteractively, there's so much happening on the C1 when it comes to depth. I can only call this particular comparison as a tie because they're just so strong. Although, if I'm being honest, I do give a slight lean to LG for this particular scene because they do render the blue at the bottom where you see like the information and like scroll, like the zoom option and the move the camera option. Next tip, you're seeing a lot more variations in between the colors like you're supposed to. So the color accuracy is way better, and that combined with that depth and clarity is giving you a better image. So that's going to be the C1 for this particular one. Now moving on to this next image, we have Spider-Man swinging really awesomely on the Q8FN with tons of color, tons of pop, tons of clarity. I really couldn't have given the LG a single thing on this particular comparison if I tried, because the Samsung was just so dominating by comparison. And honestly speaking, I'm just going to have to say maybe some color accuracy towards the bottom end of the color, but it was just too overpowering. This is one of those examples where LEDs can keep up with OLEDs even in lower lit situations if there's a lot of contrasty elements like Spider-Man's suit, the buildings, the text at the bottom, Spider-Man's shoes. These kinds of things pick up on highlights very, very well on a well-tuned television, and the Samsung Q8FN is just that. And for this, it was absolutely a treat, and I think more people need to make TVs like this because this is awesome stuff. So a lean towards the Q8FN for this one. So now we look at images like this, and this is where I kind of hit a little bit of a crossroad. They are literally so identical, I couldn't even call it for either one of them because I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked, and there's just no way to say that one is definitively better than the other on this one because they were so identical. And this is a testament to how far, LG has pushed their OLEDs, because before, Qled would have won when the colors came into question. And honestly, LG is holding their own very well. And it's that refinement to color this year, particularly on the C1, that really does great. That, again, that Alpha 9 Gen 4 chip is really coming in handy and saving it in a lot of these kinds of comparisons. So for this, it's a tie. Essentially, as you're seeing, when you get to different scenes, it changes so much. It's so hard to say that one is a definitive winner over the other. And that's why, and oftentimes in some of my videos, it may seem like I flip-flop. 1 minute I like it, 1 minute I don't. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, that's just the nature of a television. Some things are going to look better than others, and then others will have a completely 360-degree result. And I love doing these comparisons because you can really see it almost with your own eyes. Granted, this is not a 100% representation and should not be taken as such. You should trust the commentary of the person that sat on the end of both of these televisions. So again, just take my expertise and advice and run with it. But at the end of the day, you can kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. I mean, take, for example, the Q8FN at the top. Samsung has a massive problem with making everything overly green and the hue. This has always been a weakness of Samsung. They have never knocked it off. They continuously do it year after year. And even after calibration, some of that still shows in skin tonality because the color management system is so garbage, it really doesn't do anything to clean that stuff up. Well, you're seeing proof of that right here as Mary Jane has a little bit too much tungsten in her face. Now, if you look at Mary Jane at the bottom on the C10 or the C1, it's just clearer. You have a more realistic representation of how light would play out in an environment. It wouldn't be overly orange like that. And that's just how it is, man. Sometimes it's going to be a really big miss on the Qled side of things. So something to weigh up here. Also, clarity is substantially better on the C1, so the C1 takes this one. Now we get to this image, and this is where my camera started struggling a bit with dynamic range. Did not have the best ability to show you the highlights in the sun or the clouds, but I did pick up on the shadowy areas really well, so things like the buildings came out really well, and you were really able to see what the Samsung was able to do there. But the highlight was there, and it was extremely clear. The only problem is it was really, really bright. And when you have something really bright, it just really doesn't pick up on camera that greatly without a significant amount of dynamic range, as I've been saying throughout the video. But either way, you can kind of get an idea of just how stark the difference is between the amount of contrast popping off in brighter scenes on the Samsung Q8FN versus OLED. This is one of those examples where Qled destroys OLED in brighter comparisons. I know a lot of people try to say like pixel level illumination will always be better for everything no matter what. That's not true. Brighter scenes are almost always going to go to a really, really powerful Qled television or something similar or comparable. Because of this throw behind your color volume and your peak brightness, you're able to get more contrast, and it's showing right here. So I'm going to have to give this one to the Q8FN most definitely. Now, moving on to this image, this one was a little hard for me, but ultimately I ended up giving it to the Q8FN because I saw a little bit more blood flow in the facial area of the cop. I saw a lot more blood flow in the nose, around the neck, things like that, where the C1 kind of had it a little darker. His face was a little darker than I would have liked. Of course, this isn't going to show through 100%, so you're just going to have to take my word for it. But the C1 did have the clarity, albeit on the Q8FN at the top, it definitely had a lot more in the way of luminosity behind the light. I had to turn some of that down because I was clipping and I had zebras all over my camera, meaning I was overexposed, and I really had to just kind of take a little bit of a compromise for what the final image would look like. But it was very poppy, very contrasty, and a treat to look at. Though I will say the color accuracy, like on nuanced things like on the shirt of the cop and on the jacket of the cop, you see a lot more detail in that stuff on the C1. So it's really going to come down to your personal choice on what kind of viewer you are, really. And that's kind of the theme here as well. The C1, especially in scenes like this, you're going to see a lot more depth. You're going to see a lot more clarity. You're going to see even a lot more color as things start shifting. 1 minute, the C1 has so much more color than the Q8FN that it's not even funny. And then in other moments, it's the complete and total reverse. And it's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. See, right now, the Q8FN looks really good, looks really normal, and that's how it looked on my end. And right here, the C1's looking overly red. It wasn't overly red on my end. The camera just couldn't handle that level of color intensity. Essentially, it was really vibrant. It looked really good. And honestly speaking, Miles Morales never looked better. The C1 absolutely dominated this scene, and the Q8FN ended up losing because it was more pale by comparison. And that kind of held true as well. When we look at the background, you can notice like the fall leaves in the back. You can notice the foliage has more dimensionality, Miles' face more dimensionality, things like that. Like the big things that everybody looks for, that's what the C1 was able to do. Not saying the Q8FN had a bad image, but if you look very carefully around his forehead area, there's a lot more green hueish looking yellowish tint to his skin tone. And that's again going right back to that problem with their color management system, so you're not able to clean that stuff up and get what you need out of your image. Now, in images like this, it really started to get, again, right back to being difficult because they started looking really identical. Both exhibited depth and clarity in their own way because this was a really bright scene. So it got to a point where the Samsung had better luminosity on things like the gun, the highlight popping in on the side of her cheek, things like that. The bricks on the background with the blue, all that looked better on the Q8FN. But the LG did something better. It gave you a little bit more clarity in things like the lips, like the little holes, the barrels of the gun, like little things like that. Every little detail in her uniform, you could actually see the stitching. So if you're somebody that's serious about gaming, this is something that might matter to you, and even content in general. And also, the grayscale is more accurate on the C1 than it is on the Q8FN, and you can notice that in things like her hair when you see it gradate correctly from a lighter shade of like a whitish gray all the way down to a really dark gray. So honestly speaking, they both do something different. Though if I had to pick one for my personal preference, I would say the Q8FN, because I did get a lot more luminosity, and that led to some crazy impressive contrast that the C1 just wasn't capable of. Now in images like this, it was an absolute slaughter on the Q8FN from the C1. The C1 was able to render 3D-like images, like it was almost like I was watching a 3D movie, a film, event, a scene. It was really impressive to see this without any kind of need to do anything. Normally I have to grab for the remote and try to adjust something to try to balance out these TVs, but the C1, I'm pretty sure this will even come through in the video, is just more three-dimensional. The picture almost leaps off the screen, and the foreground and background are separated almost perfectly. That's the kind of stuff that you need in an image. The Q8FN hanging in there, looking really good with clarity and stuff, but it just did not hang in there as good as it could have, because honestly, things just improve with time, and this is one of those examples. Now in this scene, it's a domination in a couple different areas. The Q8FN for shadow detail, the LG for clarity and color accuracy. So that's again where you kind of have like it switches up again on you. So you'll have a moment where you'll have the black levels get a little dark in this scene on the C1, and you're losing some information that you really didn't want to lose. That's something I ran into. But ultimately speaking, you gained a little bit more in the way of accurate placements of highlights and more impressive shadows behind Mary Jane. So it was kind of like a throw up. You also did have more accuracy in her hair color, where it's actually like a reddish brownish color when hit with lower light conditions, versus, you know, here at the top at the Q8FN, where it's just appearing like she's a brunette, which is completely inaccurate. So that's just one of those things that I kind of noticed, but it is what it is. Either way, the C1 takes it for this particular one. Now looking at this image, one would think that this is kind of going to be like a tie, but I honestly had to call it for the Q8FN just simply because it had better color and better depth. If you look very carefully at Spider-Man's mask, it is appearing more three-dimensional. So this is the part where they're starting again to do this little tug of war game. And when we look at images like this, now again, it goes right back to the reverse. Now the color looks better on the Q8FN as far as her hair, her face, the scene being lit. It just looks better. Where the C1 at the bottom, not really doing it as impressively. It just kind of looks pale and dead by comparison. So these are the kinds of things that you're going to kind of pick up on as you're watching movies and TV shows and things like that. Then we go to scenes like this, and this is kind of, I wanted to throw this in there. You're going to run into this problem where you're going to have this over dimming when you start using the G-Sync feature. And I wanted to kind of showcase that off, so I kind of turned it on to show you just how dim it really gets. And as you see, it's substantially dim to the point where the people in the background just don't even look like people. So if you're a gamer as well, that's something that's going to be an ultimate deal breaker. If you already have the Q8FN, you don't deal with these problems. The C1 has these problems, and your settings are grayed out, and you do not have access to those settings when you're using a PlayStation console via PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4, for PlayStation 4 Pro. Doesn't matter. This is something you're going to be dealing with. Either way, the C1 did have excellent contrast, but it really lacked in the luminosity department, and I feel like that's because it hit that 25% window of brightness and upwards. And if you guys remember my brightness test, I had it where essentially starting at a 25% window and onwards to larger windows, you really start losing brightness, and that's kind of what happened here. Then we look at scenes like this. You can see Mary Jane very clearly on the Q8FN, and she looks more or less natural, albeit there are some discrepancies because of color science and dynamic range. So this particular example isn't going to be the most helpful, but the big differences between the two are the clarity and the shadow detail. Those are the two things I want to kind of point your attention to. The Q8 is going to have the shadow detail. The C1 at the bottom is going to have the clarity. And now when you kind of sum this all up, right? We go back and forth. We try to find a winner. Essentially, you're going to have a choice to make when you buy these TVs. Now, granted, Samsung is not what they used to be. They used to make champion TVs like this. Well, they're not trying to make champion TVs like this anymore. So now you're stuck with the downgraded version after a downgraded version of the Q8FN. And honestly speaking, it's going to be really hard to justify the newer Samsungs over this C1, because the C1, as you see, is hitting at Qled color and beating Qled color because it's performing admirably with accuracy, admirably with clarity. Every single scene is tack sharp. It's the difference between having a $500 camera lens and breaking out your $2,000 camera lens. This is the coup de grace. Like, this is the clarity that you're looking for in content. And that is going to be very powerful for people like myself. Ultimately speaking, that's what kind of got me a little weak-kneed for it, because I see the improvement. I see the refinements. Me being able to use my sharp eye that I use for photography all the time, I immediately picked up on just how much clearer it was than the C10. And if that's something that you're also on the fence on, then maybe you're going to have to go with the C10 over this particular model. All in all, I kind of want to round it out by showing you a couple more images, and then, I guess I'll get your final thoughts and impressions. You guys can either leave them in the comment section. This will be a premiere, so you guys can just ask in the chat log whatever you have a question on. But essentially, I mean, the white balance thing is a very tricky thing. As you see, there's more blue at the bottom on the C1, and at the top on the Samsung, you don't have all that. And that's kind of where you're going to run into some problems. Occasionally, you'll have some hue problems here and there when you get to lower light scenes, because LG just, for whatever reason, when you get to low light scenes, or you come out of low light scenes, like out of near black scenes, that's where you start running into problems with uniformity, particularly making sure your color accuracy is there and things like that. So Samsung with the Q8FN doesn't really struggle with that. And again, if you have the Q8FN and you watch a lot of low light stuff, that's where you're probably going to be better off. Now, scenes like this are kind of like a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Notice how LG struggles to light Mary Jane appropriately. Instead, they just blast her with brightness, and she looks like one ghost. She's like one white blurb. Where on the Q8FN at the top, she's represented perfectly. You have the glow of the blue light hitting her face, casting that shadow, that Rembrandt shadow almost on the side of her face. But then you have this warm light creating this extra shadow, and you even see her blush on her face. You see the pink in her lips. You see detail that you just don't have on the C1. So this is one of those examples when you're coming out of near black, you're going to experience some problems. So that's something you might want to prepare for if you're, I guess, the purist, so to speak. I mean, obviously no TV is perfect. Every TV has its problems, but this is one of those examples. Now, when we get to images like this, you'll see, again, it's more of the same. This is where it gets very difficult to tell the difference between the two, because, again, that ballet of going back and forth. So it's kind of like you're going to have to pick your poison. You either have more shadow detail, or you lose the brightness and shadow detail in kind of place of clarity. Now, the C1 really surprised me in this particular scene in the Spider-Man game, because not only were colors hitting, if you have this game, play this scene will blow your mind. This near black scene almost works perfectly. It's like it was made for this TV, because of the way the highlights pop off of Peter's face as he's watching Aunt May pass into the next world. It was pretty impressive to see all the nuanced colors, and I'm pretty sure you can see some of that in his uniform. You can see the accuracy in his face. So again, there are moments where the C10 comes back and redeems itself in lower light conditions, but it really depends. That's why it's so hard to say how it will perform in low light for everything, because as you see, it has a varying behavior in how it chooses to render contrast and stuff. So then again, you get to lower light scenes like this. This one is not an accurate representation of what I saw. It was well lit. I didn't have any problems, but my camera really couldn't pick up on it. So ultimately speaking, you're not going to see too much from it. So I'll just kind of move on. But essentially, it's kind of more of the same story that we've been seeing. But this is where the big difference kind of lies. The color vibrancy on the Q8FN was so powerful in this moment that you saw an almost emerald rich, just vibrant, blasting, bioluminescent shade of green that you did not have on the C1. Now, some reviewers have taken to calling this cartoonish, unrealistic, but the reality is, if you're in a bright environment and you've got a light, literally like in this scene in Spider-Man, shining behind water, it's going to reflect, and that light is going to refract off of that glass and start shining everywhere. And that really showed through very well on the Q8FN, as you see here, where you just have that accuracy in what it would look like when a bright light shines on your face. The C1, not so much. It's just this weird money green kind of looking thing. I mean, I don't even know. He looks like he's seasick. I don't understand it. But sometimes it can get color really, really wrong, and this is one of those examples. All in all, though, it does redeem itself when you get into some brighter scenes like this one in the Naruto game. It looked really good, tons of depth, tons of color, way better color accuracy. And so essentially, I call the C1 one of the most tricky TVs I've ever reviewed, because 1 minute it's fantastic, the next minute it's different, and it's confusing. And I think that's where a lot of the misunderstandings with how I review these TVs kind of come into play, when some people hear me in one video say it's beautiful, and the next it's like, what happened? Well, that's ultimately, again, going back to differences, as you guys are seeing how it's so very different. Now, as you see in this scene, this is a total domination on the C1, just totally slaughtering the Q8FN. When we look at just how green the image is by comparison, there's just no comparison to a properly dialed in color and color space. And that's just kind of what you're going to run into time and time again when you start comparing the long game. I mean, the Samsung has this weird highlighter yellow, and it does not look good. I don't care if you have the Q90T, the brand new Neo Qleds. I have seen this highlighter yellow every single time I've tested this particular image, and I always go back to it because I know it's going to be there, and sure as fire, it's always there, this ugly neon yellow that's not Naruto's hair. So yeah, that's something that you might want to think about. And then, of course, the whole skin tonality and general image just looks better on the C1. He actually has the warm peach looking color to his skin versus whatever that is at the top. Sometimes when you get to mostly yellow scenes like this, Samsung gets it so incredibly wrong that honestly it makes you hate everything about the brand. And this is one of Samsung's biggest weaknesses, and something they definitely need to work on. They need to stop with this arrogance. I mean, Jesus Christ. They need to add Dolby Vision, and they need to fix their green tinting problem, because it's definitely a major issue at this point that they just aren't doing anything about. But I'll digress, and I'll just say this. Either way you go, you're going to have a great TV. But if I had to sum it up and I had to personally pick a winner, somebody I felt did the best pound for pound, I would have to say, from everything I've seen, the LG C1 is going to be the winner, because it's representing clarity and contrast correctly, even though in some scenes it gets it wrong, and even though sometimes it trips up and it fumbles, and some moments look better on the Q8FN. Generally speaking, the LG C1 did provide the more impressive, impactful image after dialing it in, after tuning it up, and that's just as real as it gets. So if you like videos like these, smack a like on this video, ask your questions down below, subscribe and join the journey, and until the next video, I'll see you guys later.